He stood in front of a camera and cried. He begged Atlanta to help find whoever did this. He said his wife was everything to him. He said he couldn't sleep. He said the house felt empty. Then investigators looked at his phone. 23 stab wounds, one camera performance, one device that held all the answers. What happened inside that Atlanta home, and what happened after, is a case study in two things investigators now know better than ever. Killers who stage grief are not new, but cameras, smartphones, and digital trails have changed everything about how fast the truth comes out. I'm Danny Cruz. I don't have a badge. I have documents. And what the documents on this case reveal, from behavioral science literature to forensic analysis to digital evidence protocol, is the kind of story that explains why Atlanta detectives cracked this faster than the killer ever anticipated. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. I cover cases through the paper trail, the evidence logs, the behavioral studies, the forensic reports. Every week, a new case. Every case, the documents tell the story. Let's start at the beginning. The call came in from an Atlanta residence. A husband reported finding his wife. The scene that investigators walked into involved 23 stab wounds on the victim's body. That number is not incidental. That number is significant in ways that trained forensic analysts read immediately, and I'll get into exactly what it tells us in a moment. What the husband did next is what put this case into a very specific documented category. He went public. He gave interviews. He appeared visibly emotional on camera. He used the language of grief. He loved her. He missed her. He needed answers. He appealed to the public to help solve what he was framing as a mystery. This is documented behavior. It has a name in FBI behavioral analysis literature, and law enforcement training materials have covered it extensively since at least the 1980s. The term used in behavioral science is self-insertion into the investigation. It was documented formally by FBI agents studying spousal homicide patterns going back to the behavioral science unit's early work at Quantico. The principle is this: a guilty party who fears being identified will sometimes attempt to take control of the narrative by becoming the most visible person in the grief story. They insert themselves not just into the investigation, but into the public conversation around it. This is not speculation. Ann Burgess, one of the most cited researchers in criminal profiling history, documented this pattern in studies of domestic homicide suspects. The behavior appears across multiple cases: the killer who organizes search parties, the killer who holds press conferences, the killer who becomes the face of the grieving family in the media. The documented logic is about control. When you are the person the cameras follow, you control what the cameras see. This husband understood that logic instinctively or had calculated it. Either way, he executed it. He showed up on camera. He cried. He answered questions. He looked into the lens and asked for help. And for a brief period, it worked exactly the way he intended. Public sympathy leaned toward him. Comments on local news coverage expressed sorrow for his loss. Some people offered prayers. Some offered tips about other people. Atlanta homicide detectives were not moved by any of it. Here is what the documented behavioral literature says about identifying deceptive grief in these public performances. There are specific verbal and linguistic markers that trained investigators look for, and law enforcement training materials from organizations like the International Association of Chiefs of Police and the Reed Technique documentation have cataloged them for decades. The first marker is tense usage. When a person has genuinely lost someone, they frequently slip between past and present tense when speaking about the victim. It is an involuntary cognitive signal. The mind has not fully processed the loss, so the language reflects that confusion. Grief researchers call this tense confusion and document it in bereavement literature consistently. A person who is performing grief, however, tends to use past tense with striking consistency and immediacy. The victim becomes was almost immediately. She was wonderful. She was the best person. The second marker is distancing language. Behavioral analysts documented this across multiple spousal homicide cases. A grieving partner will typically use intimate, specific, personal language about their spouse. They will say her name constantly. They will reference specific memories. A person performing grief for an audience tends to use more generalized, abstract language. She was a great person. She meant everything to me. The language feels rehearsed because it is. It lacks the involuntary specificity that real grief produces. The third marker is self-focus versus victim focus. This one is the most telling in documented cases. A genuinely grieving spouse, when placed in front of a camera, will typically redirect constantly toward the victim, toward who she was, what she meant, what was lost. A guilty party performing grief will frequently redirect toward themselves, toward their own suffering, their own sleeplessness, their own need for answers. The FBI's behavioral science documentation from multiple cases shows this pattern. The language centers on I more than it centers on her. Investigators watching this husband's media appearances were logging all of it. But behavioral analysis alone does not build a case. It builds a profile. It builds a direction. What builds a case is evidence. And in 2024, the single most information-dense object in any suspect's life is the phone. Atlanta detectives obtained a warrant for his device. What investigators find on phones in these cases follows a documented pattern that digital forensics experts have written about extensively. The categories of digital evidence that break spousal homicide cases are now well established in both law enforcement literature and court records from cases across the country. The first category is search history and its timing. This is the one that juries understand immediately and that defense attorneys have the hardest time explaining away. When investigators pull deleted search history from a device and find searches related to topics like knife wounds, forensic evidence cleanup, life insurance policies, or poison detection windows, and those searches appear in the days or weeks before the victim's death, the timing creates a factual record that is nearly impossible to argue against. Deletion does not protect the suspect. Digital forensics recovery tools like Cellebrite and similar platforms are documented in court filings as capable of recovering deleted data from device storage. The searches were made. The searches were recovered. The second category is communication records, specifically deleted messages. Text threads, encrypted app conversations, social media direct messages. Investigators look for two things in this category simultaneously. They look for any communication that establishes motive, financial disputes, discussions of separation, evidence of a relationship outside the marriage. And they look for communication patterns that stopped abruptly at a suspicious time. A thread that goes suddenly quiet before the reported time of death can establish that the suspect was not where he claimed to be or was not doing what he claimed to be doing. The third category is location data. Modern smartphones are location logging devices. GPS data, cell tower triangulation records, app-based location logs from fitness trackers, food delivery apps, navigation apps, all of it creates a time-stamped map of where the phone was, and by extension, where the person carrying it was. In cases where a suspect claims to have been somewhere other than the crime scene at the time of the crime, location data has repeatedly destroyed that alibi in documented prosecutions. The phone was not where the suspect said he was. The fourth category is financial records accessible through the device. Banking apps, insurance policy documents stored in email, communication with financial advisors or attorneys regarding assets. In spousal homicide cases where financial motive is part of the prosecution's argument, the phone often provides the roadmap. Insurance policy amounts, recent changes to beneficiary designations, outstanding debts. These create the documented financial context that prosecutors use to establish why the crime occurred. What Atlanta investigators found on this husband's phone was not a puzzle, it was a timeline. Now let's go back to the crime scene itself, because the 23 stab wounds are not just a number, they are a forensic document. In wound pattern analysis, a discipline documented in forensic pathology literature from medical examiners' offices and taught in forensic science programs, the number and distribution of wounds tells investigators specific things about the nature of the attack. This is not interpretation. This is applied science with a documented methodology. A small number of wounds in a vital area, 1, 2, 3, typically indicates a controlled, targeted attack. The attacker knew what they were doing and stopped when the objective was achieved. This pattern is associated more often with professional violence or premeditated targeted killings. A large number of wounds, in the double digits, tells a different story, but that story has two possible interpretations that investigators must distinguish. The first interpretation is frenzy, an attack driven by extreme emotional volatility in the moment, sometimes associated with jealous rage, a domestic confrontation that escalated beyond the attacker's control, a crime of passion in the classical criminological sense. The second interpretation is staging, a high wound count deliberately inflicted to make the scene appear frenzied, when the attack was actually controlled and premeditated. Forensic pathologists distinguish between these two using several documented markers. They look at the distribution of wounds across the body. A genuine frenzy attack tends to produce wounds across multiple body regions without a clear pattern because the attacker is not in control. A staged frenzy tends to produce wounds with subtle clustering. The attacker is inflicting additional wounds on a victim who may already be incapacitated or deceased, and the hand moves differently when the emotional driver is simulation rather than genuine volatility. They look at defensive wounds on the victim. In a genuine confrontation, victims typically sustain defensive injuries, wounds to the hands, forearms, wrists, from attempting to stop the attack. The presence or absence of specific defensive wound patterns and their distribution informs the medical examiner's analysis of how the attack unfolded. They look at blood distribution on the suspect and at the scene. 23 stab wounds produce significant blood. The physics of a high wound count attack create a distinctive blood distribution pattern. When that pattern is inconsistent with what the suspect's clothing and the scene documentation show, it becomes forensic evidence of a post-crime staging event. Atlanta's forensic team documented all of it. The picture that emerged from the autopsy, the crime scene reconstruction, and the digital forensics was not the picture the husband had tried to put on camera. The picture the evidence told was one of a premeditated act, followed by an attempt to weaponize public grief as a shield. He had counted on the cameras protecting him. He had counted on the sympathy of an audience. He had counted on the emotional weight of a crying husband to create noise that investigators would have to sort through before they reached him. What he had not counted on was that investigators do not start from the cameras. They start from the documents. They start from the phone. The prosecution's case was built in layers. The behavioral analysis established the pattern of self-insertion and identified the specific verbal markers in his media appearances that were inconsistent with documented genuine grief responses. This is used not to convict. Behavioral analysis is not sufficient on its own, but to establish investigative direction and, when corroborated by hard evidence, to give the jury context for understanding the defendant's actions after the crime. The digital evidence formed the structural spine of the prosecution. The location data placed the phone, and therefore the husband, at the residence during the window when investigators determined the victim's death occurred. Communication records established motive. Deleted messages that forensic recovery tools pulled from the device's storage documented a relationship in crisis, financial stress, and conversations that investigators characterized as directly relevant to establishing intent. Search history that had been deleted but was recovered showed a pattern of information seeking that prosecutors argued was consistent with planning, not with the behavior of someone who had no knowledge of what was about to happen. The forensic pathology evidence corroborated the phone data. The wound pattern analysis supported the prosecution's argument that this was not a heat-of-moment attack, but a controlled, sustained assault. The distribution of wounds, the forensic analysis of defensive injuries, and the blood pattern documentation were consistent with the timeline that the phone data established. 23 wounds, one phone, one set of deleted searches that were never actually deleted, one location record that contradicted everything he had said on camera. This is the documented reality of how these cases break in the current investigative environment, and it is worth understanding the systemic shift that this case represents, because it has implications that go beyond Atlanta. For most of human history, a person who committed a private crime and then publicly performed grief was operating in an environment where investigative capacity was limited. The behavioral analysis had to be extraordinary to overcome the absence of hard physical evidence. Witnesses had to exist and had to come forward. Forensic science had to be both available and definitive. The smartphone changed every one of those constraints. The device that lives in every pocket is also the most comprehensive surveillance system that any individual has ever voluntarily carried. It logs location continuously. It stores communications that users believe are deleted. It creates a time-stamped record of what the user was thinking about, through searches, through app usage, through browsing history, across any window of time investigators request via warrant. This is documented in law enforcement literature as one of the most significant shifts in investigative capability in the history of criminal investigation. FBI documentation, academic criminology research, and published forensic science literature all address the transformation that smartphones have created in homicide investigations. The case clearance data for homicides in which digital forensics are applied versus those in which they are not shows a documented difference in outcomes. The husband who stood in front of cameras in Atlanta had not absorbed this reality. He was operating on an older model, the model in which controlling the narrative in public meant controlling the investigation. He executed that model competently. The crying was convincing. The language was rehearsed. The media appearance was structured correctly, but investigators were not watching the broadcast. They were building a warrant. The moment investigators retrieved his phone, the case moved from a behavioral profile to a documented prosecution. Everything that the performance had been designed to prevent, the focused attention of Atlanta homicide detectives on him as the primary suspect, was made inevitable by what the device revealed. Digital forensics experts who have written about cases like this in professional literature make a consistent point. Suspects who attempt to manipulate public narrative in the social media era frequently accelerate their own exposure. The same drive to control the public conversation that sends them in front of cameras also causes them to use their phones to manage the situation, to communicate with people they shouldn't be communicating with, to search for information they shouldn't be searching for, to check their own media coverage obsessively. Each of those actions adds to the digital record that investigators are compiling simultaneously. The phone is not neutral. The phone is a witness. In this case, it was the most consequential witness in the prosecution. Atlanta's homicide detectives worked the case the way experienced investigators work all cases of this type, with a documented, methodical approach that starts with the victim, works outward to the relationship, and arrives at the suspect through evidence rather than assumption. The timeline reconstruction that forensic teams build in spousal homicide cases is not guesswork. It is a documented methodology that integrates physical forensics, digital forensics, witness accounts where they exist, and behavioral analysis into a coherent sequence of events that can be presented to a jury. The jury in this case did not need to be convinced by the tears. The jury was presented with documents, location records, communication content, search history timestamps, forensic pathology findings, wound pattern analysis, blood distribution documentation. The tears were on video, the evidence was in files, and in 2024 in a courtroom, the files win. He was convicted. What this case leaves behind, beyond the verdict, beyond the sentence, is an instructional record for anyone who studies how justice functions when behavioral science, digital forensics, and physical evidence work together. It is also an instructional record for the field of investigative journalism, because cases like this reveal systemic patterns that matter beyond the individual crime. The pattern of self-insertion into investigations by guilty parties is documented. The pattern of media performance as a defensive strategy is documented. The pattern of digital evidence as the mechanism that breaks those strategies is increasingly documented. Atlanta was not the first case. It will not be the last. But the speed with which the digital evidence dismantled the public performance is notable. He had days of sympathy. Investigators had weeks of documented digital evidence. The phone had been in his pocket the entire time. For cases that come after this one, and there will be cases that come after this one, the lesson is already written in the behavioral science literature, in the forensic science literature, and now in the public court record of this prosecution. Cameras are not shields. Grief performances do not redirect investigations. And the device you use to manage your narrative is the same device that investigators will request in their first warrant application. The documents always tell the truth. The people sometimes don't. I'm Danny Cruz. That is the documented record of what happened in Atlanta and what it means for how these investigations work now. If you've been here since the beginning, you already know. I don't fill time with speculation. Every case I cover comes with the paper trail. Subscribe now if you want to keep following the evidence. And the next case I'm covering, the documents are already in front of me. You'll want to be here when I open that file.